Thank you, Rob, for sending me the thing in a format I could read.
No problem. You're welcome.
And I'm sure you knew what Luddite meant.
No, that was my word for the day yesterday.
Okay, you looked it up? Did you look it up?
Yeah.
Okay, it fits, doesn't it? The thing in a format I could read.
No problem. You're welcome.
And I'm sure you knew what Luddite meant.
No, that was my word for the day yesterday.
Okay, you looked it up? Did you look it up?
Yeah.
Okay, it fits, doesn't it? The thing in a format I could read.
No problem. You're welcome.
And I'm sure you knew what Luddite meant.
Okay, that's scary.
Sorry about that. That was my fault. I had the live stream starting in another window. I just closed it.
Oh.
Sorry.
Another example of Ludditism.
Right.
When you took 75% of the member yeses, or 75 yeses had to be available. Anyway, was that over just the people that answered that? Because not everybody answered all the questions. So I was just curious how that.
Yes.
What that 70. Okay, that's what I figured.
But of the responses that we received, 75%
for each
voted yes.
For each item. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's a good question, Leslie, because not everyone answered every question as you noted, and the survey was long and
as we know,
quite long. And we gave people, the option of just responding to certain sections or responding to the whole thing.
And I'm sure as people went through your list of items that were, didn't quite make the cut, we were going, oh no, that was a good one. And that was a good one.
Yeah, we felt that way too. So we're going to say more about that during the meeting.
Okay.
If you're just joining us, welcome everyone. This is the 4th Climate Action Plan Task Force workshop. And looks like we have 24 people so far. So I think maybe we'll wait another minute or so just to give everyone else a chance to arrive. Okay, it's 1 minute after the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Kim Morrow, Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at Veritas Group, and I'm here with my colleague, Belina Bentledge, an associate at Veritas Group, and we are pleased to be leading this 4th in the series of workshops with the Climate Action Plan Task Force. This meeting is being live streamed, and so we welcome all the live stream viewers as well. The meeting will be recorded and posted on the project website following this meeting. So I've shared some slides. You can see, let me bring up that window just a moment. The objectives of today's meeting are first, to review and receive some feedback from all of you on the refined list of climate action plan strategies, to also let you know the the results of our strategy survey. That wasn't one of these three, but that's what we're going to start with today. The strategy survey that you all recently took. We are also going to show you some additional equity strategies that we propose for inclusion in the plan, and we'd like to get your feedback on those. And then finally, we have some guests who will be arriving. They are from a company called Ecotone. They are subcontractors on this project, and they will be doing the cost benefit analysis for the climate action plan. And so they are going to share their model and their approach for doing the cost benefit analysis. So you can see the agenda for today. Again, we have 3 hours, and we'll start with the strategy survey results, then go to the equity strategies, then look at our refined list, and then we'll have a break and finish up with the cost benefit analysis. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Belina to say a few additional words.
All right. Thanks, Kim, and good morning, everyone. I just have some Zoom logistics for us today and a process update. So just a reminder, similar to all of our previous workshops, to please stay on mute to reduce background sounds. If you have a clarifying question throughout today's workshop and we're not at a discussion point, go ahead and put your question or comment in the chat. We'll have several moments today where we will go into some deep discussion. So we'll ask you during those discussion points to use that raised hand feature in Zoom. And then for our process update, as you all know who took the survey, thank you. I'll be saying thank you a lot today, but thank you for taking the survey. We're going through the refinement process on the climate action plan strategies. So like Kim said, we wanted to update you on the results of that survey, where we are today, and then based on discussion today, where we will be going. So we'll be focusing on those strategies that we sent late yesterday that were flagged for removal, as well as those additional equity strategies. So after today, we did want to give you a heads up that you will soon be receiving a full list of strategies. We know we didn't send you a full list of these were the ones that are included. Those were kind of included with the PDFs you saw with all of the different scoring. So you will eventually get that full list of strategies. We just wanted to go through a discussion with you all today. And when you do get that full list of strategies, we want to note that it's not the final list. We still have a refinement process to go through with you all through small groups, focus teams to really narrow down strategies, refine them, and get them to where they need to be for the city of Salem. And before turning it back to Kim, I would like to apologize that I'll have to leave at the break for another meeting today, but as always, Kim and I will be available via email after today's workshop. So thanks everyone, and Kim, I'll turn it back to you for a review of the strategy survey results.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Belina. So let's jump right in. We want to thank all of you, as Belina said, we'll thank you a couple times here. We sent you a very lengthy survey, and we really appreciate your patience in going through that and giving us your feedback. I know it was a little tedious, but it was also really important, and we really appreciate your feedback. So today I just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of give you some highlights and summaries of the survey. So the purpose of the survey was to gauge the Salem community members' priorities for implementing climate action plan strategies. And the objective was to identify which ideas should be included and which should not. There were a total of 211 ideas across 7 action areas. And those ideas had been sourced from all of you, task force members, also from the general community in a couple of feedback surveys and input activities that we did on the website. And they also came from subject matter experts. In the survey, we asked for qualitative feedback using a ranking scale, just a simple scale, as you know, if you took it, yes, unsure, or no. And we bolded the strategies that had a high GHG impact. That means greenhouse gas impact. I think all of you know that by now. So that people could see a little bit which strategies would have more impact than others. Respondents were also able to leave open-ended comments, which were very valuable. We ran the survey in 2 ways, for 2 audiences. One was for all of you, just for task force members. That ran from March 8th to the 21st. And we got a total of 30 responses, and that's out of about 40 task force members. So that was a great response from all of you. And then we also ran the same content for the general community, and that ran from March 12th through 28th. And we received 186 responses on that one. So a few words about the results. That you all, task force members, rated strategies generally much more positively than community members. And that is likely because you, at this point in the process, you've learned a lot about what these ideas mean and what we need to do to achieve Salem's greenhouse gas reduction goals. So for example, on 96 of the ideas, there was a 75% or higher yes ranking from all of you. But whereas the community responses, only 7 ideas ranked that much agreement. So a pretty big difference there. Not totally unexpected, but interesting to note as well. So to give you an idea of what were some of the most popular ideas, I pulled out the top 10 from each list. The list on the left actually has kind of a repeat in it, and so I went ahead and put the 11th on there too, so we could think of it as a top 10 list. So the number one highest ranking strategy that all of you ranked was increasing bus service. And then it went on to connecting sidewalks, promoting EVs, improving walking paths to bus stops, communicating climate risk to underserved populations, improving our trees, improving energy efficiency in municipal buildings. That one was very similarly worded as another strategy, which was our mistake. We should have corrected that so it wasn't a duplicate. But so you can think of those as basically one strategy. And the next one, number 9, was support for smaller homes and accessory dwelling units. The 10th was educating residents on climate risks. And the last one was aligning the city's efforts with the Oregon Global Warming Commission findings and reports. So that just kind of gives you a snapshot idea of where the task force members' preferences lie. And then if you look at the list on the right, you can see there's a fairly big difference in what the preferences were that came from the community. I won't read through all of these, but you can see they have much more to do with green spaces, trees, native plants, gardens, etc., and a little bit about recycling. So that can be instructive. And then going to the other side of the list, the bottom 10, the number one least popular strategy in both audiences was prohibiting service to the Salem airport. So no one is in favor of that idea. And we suspected that, but we wanted to, that was proposed, I think, by a member of the community in one of the input activities we did. And we just wanted to gauge opinion on that. So that was helpful. Implementing congestion pricing was the second least popular idea in both audiences. That I think you're aware of, but that has to do with imposing additional pricing on traffic, congested traffic in downtown areas. It's a strategy that's only being used in certain large cities around the world, not applicable to Salem, most likely. So I won't read the rest of these, but you can see how the rest of these lined up for both all of you, the task force, and the community. The other ones, besides those top 2, were a little different in terms of people's preferences. But I think those were very instructive. You all left some very thoughtful comments in the comments section, and I want to thank you for that as well. A lot of you dropped some more of your expertise and references for us to follow up on to get additional information or cross-check ideas with existing efforts. And you also, expanded on your opinions and preferences and concerns. And so I just pulled out some of the ones that kind of rose to the top. So many of you expressed concern about or just questions about which strategies will actually reduce GHG emissions, wanting to make sure we approach those ambitious goals that the City Council has set. People noted that there needs to be a balance with livability and equity issues. There were some strategies that have more to do with livability than actually reducing GHG emissions. Those were in there because those tend to be the strategies that increase a community's resilience to climate change. So, you know, social bonds and wellness and improving equity actually makes a community more resilient. But I think a lot of people were kind of wondering, why is this in here? Or this seems like too much of a stretch from a climate action plan. So we definitely heard those concerns. And then there were questions about, you know, there were several travel related strategies that really fall under the purview of chariots. And there are several energy related strategies that fall under the purview of our utilities. And so it was just kind of noted that, you know, the city would be responsible for certain things and these other partners would be responsible for others, and which actually belong in this climate action plan, or who would be responsible for implementing those. Very important points that all need further discussion. Regarding parking, there was, you know, an understandable tension between the understandable need to reduce car travel, to reduce those emissions that come from single occupancy driving. But also there's the acknowledgement that if we're developing downtown, we need to have parking there. And it really has a direct impact on Salem businesses if their customers can't park nearby. So I think everyone understands that tension, and just noting that we have to thread a needle there. One thing that was interesting, kind of across the board, there was not much interest in educational campaigns across a range of issues. Although you saw in the top 10 list, there was an interest in educating residents about their climate risks, but not so much doing kind of broad educational campaigns about reducing emissions or safe driving, that kind of thing. There was general support for transitioning to electric vehicles, but acknowledgement that it needs to be done thoughtfully to make sure that transition is equitable, and also that you know, things like maintenance and accessibility, charging for charging stations, et cetera, are done thoughtfully. There was certainly support for increasing density in Salem, but there are different ideas for how it should be done. Some people enthusiastically supported removing setback requirements, and other people thought that setbacks still need to be used in certain cases, and other opinions about how increasing density should be done. There was concern about the potential of a divisive social impact on if taxes or bans were implemented. So for example, if a gas tax were implemented, what kind of division that might lead to in the community, or if natural gas hookups were banned. There was concern that would divide the community a lot. There was certainly support for more diverse and equitable decision-making on the part of city leadership going forward. There was very low support for cultivating arts and culture. Again, concerns about why that was in a climate action plan. And then I'm sure a lot of people support housing affordability, but they felt, again, that was kind of a stretch to relate that to climate resilience. Or maybe people were just thinking of GHG reduction. But again, the reason some of those were in there initially is that they help to make a community more equitable, and it helps to, you know, to have more economic equity strengthens a community. But we certainly heard those concerns. There were several strategies that had diverse opinions. Some really supported and some did not. And there were differences between what you all, the task force, thought and what the members of the community thought. So I just pulled out 4 of those for discussion. Researching the feasibility of a gas tax received a fair amount of support from the task force. A lot of people unsure about that, but definitely stronger no votes on the part of the community. And in terms of that issue of charging for parking in high use areas, most of the task force said, yes, that's probably a good idea. But the community, most of the community members said no. But 1/3 of them did say yes. So that's kind of interesting. Implementing a trip reduction ordinance for Salem employers over 100 people. This would be a policy that encouraged employees of major employers to basically not drive as much in single occupancy vehicles to work. So encouraging more carpooling, active transportation, busing, biking, et cetera. the majority of the task force members were in favor, and yet 1/3 almost were unsure about this, probably needing more information. And yet most of the community members were opposed to that idea. And in terms of requiring that all new development be all electric, or in other words, not allowing new natural gas hookups, the task force members were kind of evenly split between yes and not sure. And the community was solidly against that idea. So those give you some interesting results that can be used going forward. So that's basically the summary that I had prepared. We had sent the survey results to you all last week, so hopefully you had a chance to review those. There is a public version that has now been posted on the website that includes a little bit of an introduction to make it a little bit more accessible. And I also want to note that we did get some late data. One response shifted a little bit, and so the report that is posted on the website is slightly different than the one that we emailed you last week. So go to the website for the definitive version. But I'll stop there and just wanted to ask what your responses, questions, opinions were to the survey results. And if you could use the raise hand function, great, that would be great. Ken, how about you?
The question I have is, I would have been approached by a couple of folks who saw the survey as too lengthy to complete within the time frame. Was wondering if there would be any possibility of extending the opportunity to provide input.
Well, we could, we don't have plans to do that at this point. We've already done a lot of work on analyzing and preparing the final reports and so on, but we will certainly later this fall, we will be asking for more community input on the draft climate action plan. So that will be the next time that we'll ask for community input. John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, how many, I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning of your presentation. How many community members responded?
186.
So that's actually a very minimal part of a very small number. I don't get any sense that it's representative of the community, other than we learned something about the 186 members who responded.
Mm-hmm.
So just, I have, it's sort of a self-selected group. So I just don't know how much weight to put on it. And I sort of agree with Ken. I think that there would be additional outreach that is needed. In my second comment, I think people were reacting to ideas without knowing fully what the ideas meant. Mm-hmm. And I include myself in that, so.
I'm sure that's true. And this was sort of a temperature check.
Yeah.
And later, as I mentioned, in the fall, we're going to release a draft climate action plan, which will, of course, have text, and it will kind of walk people through more what these are and provide more full explanation. And then we will be asking for people's feedback at that point. So thanks for your comment. Jane?
Yes, my question is on the natural gas hookups. As everybody knows, probably the leading industry that would be impacted by that is our restaurant industry. Have we had any input from them? I could see them just becoming unglued if this was a requirement that they could no longer build a restaurant with a natural gas hookup. That's how they prepare food.
Right, right. I don't believe we have discussed this idea with the restaurant industry. And keep in mind, I think the actual wording of the strategy is research the feasibility of. So okay. It's not saying implement it, it's saying look into it. And so there would have to be a whole process after that point to bring stakeholders to the table. And even then, if it were decided to move forward, I imagine it would be 10, 15 years out into the future. It would have to be something that's really planned for.
Okay, and then just one other quick observation more on item 110 under community, continuing online city council meetings. As a president of the Salem Planning Commission, I have seen a incredible decline in the community participation in our hearings because they can only do it online. So I think that's really kind of a negative result on one hand of having to do our meetings, public meetings through Zoom.
Okay.
It's an observation.
Thanks for that feedback.
You bet.
Robert.
Could you, I think one of the things that was, I think would be interesting beyond the survey results would be the comments that were received from the public. Can you characterize some of those generally?
Sure. We didn't share those with you because we received quite a few, and many of them were highly negative. People who are resisting the whole idea that the city is doing a climate action plan, and they're kind of criticizing the city. I wonder if Rob would like to say another word about that. Rob spent more time with the public comments than I did.
Yeah, I think Kim, I think you did a fair job there of summarizing it. Yes, so a lot of people were opposed to any new, taxes. So that was a very common theme in the public comments. And then just, I think this was kind of just talked briefly. That a lot of people were unsure. Maybe some of the wording was new to them, or it was a concept they weren't familiar with. So they were letting us know that they didn't quite understand what they were being asked. And then there were some positive comments, of course, people suggesting that some of these are critical and that we must move on them immediately. So I think that generally summarizes what we heard from those open-ended responses.
Great, thank you.
Alex.
So my question is towards the three of y'all. It's no surprise that some of the some of the stuff that we've been talking about is gonna, like, a lot of people are not gonna see the connection between climate, resiliency, and race, especially when you guys talk about equity, or when we bring up the issue of equity. Being like one out of, I think, 3 people of color in this group, I raised the question in the beginning: how will you guys, or what do you guys have implemented to not have the voices being drowned out when it comes towards equity? And it looks like this survey, I think the best time for y'all to tell us, like, what do you guys have planned to not drown out our voices is right now, after hearing this survey, because you mentioned, or one of y'all mentioned, that a lot of people weren't in favor towards, like, equity or low income housing. So, like, I think right now is the best time to really hear what you guys have implemented to not drown out the people who are the most affected when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Alex. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about equity in a few minutes, so I invite you to join in on that discussion as well.
But do you guys have anything to not have our voices drowned out, or are you guys planning on, are you like, well, what's going to happen? That's really what I want to know.
Yeah, Alex, I can speak to that briefly if that's okay, Kim. So Alex, part of the refinement process that we went through when we received this survey feedback, we looked at, and I'll share more about this, but we looked at all the strategies that were flagged for removal, and we went through and pulled out the strategies, one that were likely to have a high greenhouse gas reduction potential. And we said those need to stay in. So those are recommended to stay in. And we did this similar process for strategies that would have an impact on equity. So if they received a lower vote, we said those need to stay in because we're not going to get good outcomes if those are removed. So we can talk more about those, but that's just a brief summary of what we did there.
Yeah, so in other words, Alex, it's really important to us to make sure that those equity concerns or strategies that will increase equity are retained in the plan, and we all need to have a voice in making sure that happens. Those of you who've already asked a question, if you no longer have a question, if you could remove your hand so I know who's waiting. Casey.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So 3 things that were my takeaways is, one, I thought it was really funny that the highest ranked thing was, yes, we want more buses. And the lowest ranked thing was basically, yes, we want more planes. So we want both of those things, but the fact that like how different they are in GHG emissions, I just think is pretty funny from a climate survey. The other thing that I thought, and I put it in chat, but just for people that don't have chat open, is the difference between the public and the task force shows a pretty big educational gap component, probably, especially where there's a lot of public survey responses that are like 50 to 60% negative or no, which there were a lot of in the lower rankings. So they might have been near the bottom, but it was only barely near the bottom. And so the difference or the discrepancy there shows a need for more of an educational campaign to get people's awareness up. And so that leads me to the third point, which is the difference in the understanding between how a lot of these things intersect, and not just from an equity lens, but from a business development lens. Like we can move forward with greenhouse gas emissions reductions strategies and be successful with growing development and growing the city and doing all the things that we want to do from an economic standpoint. And so I think folks lack probably the understanding of how all of that can work. And so as I think John mentioned, like just a lot of this is done in a vacuum, the survey, where people don't necessarily know what some of these things mean and how they could be operationalized. And so that could lend itself to less positive kind of remarks.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Casey. And again, I think that comes back to, that's the job that the climate action plan needs to do. The plan needs to communicate that integrated vision of what can be, and it needs to show some examples of interesting innovation and cross partnerships that Salem could implement. Janet.
Hi, so I teach research methods, and so I have a few comments. The first is the survey is not representative. It wasn't intended to try to be representative. So we don't really have to question that. It's not representative. It also had a lot of jargon. Even I thought it had a lot of jargon, so that was problematic. And then it also had multiple questions within one question, like, do you support X and Y? Maybe you support X but not Y, so that makes questions problematic as well. I also think that because there wasn't much advertising of the survey, what we got were people who were really supportive and really unsupportive. So we have that bifurcation, and people who have like an interest in business as usual. What I did when I parsed the data was I looked at, what things had over 50% support. So I'm a little confused as to why that wasn't a category that you looked at, because there's actually a lot more overlap if you look at that category. So for example, you pointed out the transit services, the finishing the sidewalk system and repairing sidewalks, but there's also reducing waste audits, identifying diversion opportunities for waste, extending producer liability, establishing a baseline for waste and monitoring progress. You also pointed out that there was support for representing residents and kind of bringing in community organizations to find out their needs and have them work to kind of shape planning and development. And then preserving green spaces. But there was also agreement on energy efficiency for city-owned buildings. There was also agreement on active commuting programs and developing those for big employees. Also amending the Salem transportation system plan to include more walking, cycling, and transit was part of the agreement. And then all new power lines need to be underground, and then having a citywide EV charging network. All of those got over 50%. So I think if we think of agreement more broadly, there's actually kind of more overlap than some of your slides made it look like.
Oh yeah, absolutely. My slides were just kind of picking out a couple of details, and I only highlighted the top 10 because I didn't want to have to go through a list of 100 strategies with you. But we thank you for noticing that, Janet, and those are all included in the survey results that we sent you, so you can see how many strategies did receive broad support. And we are taking the feedback we receive from the public and interfacing it with our knowledge as consultants and our GHG analysis to know what Salem really needs to implement to reach its goals. So we're considering a range of inputs as we approach final recommendations. Are there any remaining questions on the survey before Tom?
Thank you. I thought I pressed the hand up button, but I don't know how to do this stuff. Just a few general comments. First, the task force is ahead of the public, and we're ahead of the public because we have more specific knowledge, which leads to we need to do education in some way. And I saw Janet's comments that broad public things aren't as good as one-on-one. Secondly, I agree with all the comments that this is kind of self-selected. We're people who are very much in favor and people who are very much against. I'd be interested in some sort of statistical analysis along John's point. There's 186 people took it. How does that compare with other cities? The final thing is two final things. One, it was apparent to me that there's a focus on equity of all the task force members in all the issues we're talking about. And the council looks at that way, which leads me to there are things that are already under council consideration that we're talking about, or will be under council consideration. The gas tax, I'm chair of the finance committee, and we're going to be looking at that. The airport issue, we've got some funding going toward a study of it. The parking issue, especially parking downtown. The city has to take the lead in a lot of these things, and that was another emphasis. And finally, if you're places that have 50% approval right now, back to Janet's point, that's a pretty strong base once you hit in with the education and everything else. It's not like we're going from 20% approval. You've got to get above 50. You're already right at 50 or a little more. So I think it would be easier to educate those people into something. And finally, all this stuff has to consider the council goals. Right. You know, at some point, I'm sure you're going to give us an analysis of how we're going to enter that. You know, right. Transportation is the big issue to me.
Right. All great points. Thank you, Tom. Ian.
I was actually just going to say what Councilor Anderson just said, which is, in my estimation, we have marching orders from the council of goals to meet. And the question is, how do we plug and play that? And so I think the survey results need to inform that, but they cannot be the end all be all, because we have our marching orders on how to get to net zero by 2050. Right. I will note that I'm thrilled by the support for public transit. I definitely think that is the ready-made solution to address our biggest climate action challenge here in the region, which is transportation emissions. I am a little disconcerted that a lot of the other things that in my mind go hand in hand with transportation were not ranked nearly as high, like the build out of the sidewalk infrastructure. You need sidewalks to be able to get to bus stops, or the parking minimums. If we prioritize the storage of automobiles above people moving, I think we're gonna not see the designs or the desired outcomes that we're hoping for. But just wanted to flag that as an issue. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ian. Yeah, we noticed that too, that several of those strategies ideally need to work together to make some real gains. And again, yeah, we won't be completely relying on the survey results to guide next direction. Okay.
Kim, Councilor Nordyke has her hand up.
Oh, sorry about that. Councilor Nordyke. Go ahead.
No problem. I know there's a lot of participants this morning, and I want to thank everyone for their thoughtful comments on these issues. I understand there's been a great deal of comment about who responded to the survey and whether that's a good gauge or not. And I would just like to remind folks that even if we blasted the survey opportunity to the entire city population, there are some segments of the population who will never respond, but who are nonetheless very much impacted by climate. And that would be some of our most low income individuals in the area. There are so many folks who do not have internet, who do not have the level of education to understand the degree of jargon that Janet mentioned, and so on. So low-income individuals oftentimes are the most impacted by climate change and in general for a variety of reasons, which we need not get into now. But I would just encourage folks that no matter how many times we blast opportunities for input, we may not be hearing from the folks who will be impacted the most by climate. So anytime I see surveys calling for, say, public transit or affordable housing or urban density as a means to improve affordability of housing, just know that there are a lot of people in poverty who absolutely support these measures. A lot of our essential workers rely on public transit. A lot of our low-income seniors rely on public transit. A lot of our unsheltered rely on public transit and rely on other means of affordability of housing to lift themselves out of homelessness. They will not be responding to this survey anytime soon, but those are some of the voiceless individuals of our community who will very much benefit from action by this task force. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Nordijk. That's wonderfully said and a great reminder of our charge to remember to speak for the voices that are not here in this room. Looks like Wendy, you have a comment.
I don't have a question as much as a comment, which is, I think we're all talking about this survey, and the reality is that we need to acknowledge that the survey, without detailed explanation, even amongst our community, even amongst ourselves, was not a significant data point. It was simply a gauge to see where the task force was and the 187 community members were at. But I just feel like I was taking it and I was confused. I can't even imagine if I were a member of the public and or a member of the public that doesn't speak English, or a member of the public that doesn't have access to some of the things that others have said, which is the internet. So I just think we just need to acknowledge that this is a snapshot that didn't provide a great deal of detailed information as to what each item really meant for this community. And so as we look forward to further community input, and I heard it that there will be more information, that as we look at the future public input, that it has more information, more detailed information, and that it is accessible in a variety of languages, as well as people with disabilities and others. So that's just my comment, is I just feel like we can't put too much emphasis on this survey results, really, because I will admit that I didn't even understand what some of the items really meant myself. And I can't imagine if I were someone just, clicking in and taking this survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Very good points. Okay, it's time on our agenda to move to discussion of the equity strategies that we have added to the list since you took that survey. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Belina.
All right, thank you, Kim, and thank you everyone for your comments so far. I'm going to share my screen here. So what you'll see here, and again, as I mentioned at the top of our meeting, you will eventually be receiving the whole set of strategies across all action areas, but today I wanted to focus on the community action area and approximately 16 or so new equity strategies that were added. And I apologize that we weren't able to get these into the survey that you reviewed. We've been having some ongoing conversations with the city, recognizing that the city is working on enhancing equity processes and outcomes in their decision-making and engagement practices. So what I'll do now is we'll scroll through here and I'll highlight the new strategies. They will be in bold. And the source of these strategies mainly come from the state of Oregon's climate equity blueprint, as well as some suggestions from city staff, as well as task force members. So as we created these strategies that you'll see today, these include considerations that we've heard from you during our workshops, as well as conversations in small groups that we've had with you, interviews with you and subject matter experts, including Gretchen Bennett from the Salem Human Rights Commission. And as I mentioned earlier too, for these strategies, as well as all strategies, we'll be setting up some small groups, focus teams to review all strategies to go more in depth. But we wanted to share these with you today, and then I'll ask you some questions about these strategies. So first up, again, the new strategies will be in bold. Strategies will be here in this column C, and then the objective level are in column B. So pay attention to this column C. The first two that we have included, like I said, are from the state of Oregon's climate equity blueprint, and these have to do largely with funding opportunities. And so this will be a point for the focus teams to really consider, knowing that these came from the state level document and guidance for state agencies. How could these be adapted at the city level? But these, I'll read them to everybody so that you can see and hear them. Establish targeted funding to fund specific community needs defined not only by a geographic location, but also by income, environmental burdens, and number of investments in that area already, as well as other factors to be determined by the city related to equity. And then identify funding opportunities such as grants or dedicated project funds to create an adequate budget for community-based organizations to build their capacity to engage with these climate action plan strategies. So recognizing that the city is largely responsible for many of the strategies in the climate action plan, but communities in Salem should be given the opportunities to engage with the implementation, and those opportunities also include funding to do so. So I'll scroll down here again. The next two have to do largely with accessibility. So we know, and the city has heard this over the years, that there needs to be better efforts for providing documents and information relating to planning, especially around the climate action plan, in languages other than English. So making sure that the city is providing effective communication and messages, as well as continuing to follow the best practices that are described in the state of Oregon's climate equity blueprint. So scrolling down again, two new strategies here focus on the relationships between the city and Indigenous peoples. So recognizing that the city does have existing memorandums of understanding, MOUs, with various tribal communities and tribal governments. So continuing those good relationships. And then the second strategy comes from a few interviews that we've conducted, recognizing that due to the extremely reprehensible historical colonial trauma that has been enacted in the area, Indigenous communities have learned how to cope with the trauma associated with displacement. And we know that future casting, looking at potential climate migration, we know we've talked about in our workshops together, as we know there's current climate displacement happening. So collaborating with Indigenous communities to help people heal from trauma of displacement. And then scrolling down again, two additional strategies here. Engaging residents in the neighborhoods and areas of Salem that will be most impacted by climate change, and pursuing and advancing opportunities that allow communities to identify their own needs, their own interests, and their vision for the future. And then connecting communities with, as mentioned before, financial and also technical assistance to inform and influence city level decision-making surrounding the climate action plan and the implementation of strategies in the plan. So these two strategies are all about working with communities, that it's not just a top-down approach from the city saying we're doing this in your neighborhood, here we go, but it's getting feedback from people in neighborhoods and communities and working together to make the most appropriate solutions and implementation of strategies here. And then these three new strategies scrolling down here are all about the city building its own internal capacity to better integrate inclusion and equity practices. So making sure that city staff and departments participate in ongoing intercultural competency trainings and workshops. And we know that hiring is a difficult situation for cities, not just Salem, but recognizing cities across the country are in budget shortfalls, but looking at who could be in charge, not just in terms of strict implementation of Salem's climate action plan, but really keeping an eye and ear on the ground for environmental justice considerations with implementation. And then finally, in this section, the state of Oregon's climate equity blueprint has a revision to what we've all heard of SMART goals. They changed it to SMART T goals. So the I and the E here in this stand for inclusion and equitable. So making sure that goals are SMART as well as inclusive and equitable. And then finally, the last set of new strategies here involve data collection and data sharing processes. So we've shared that the city GIS bank called Data Salem will have relevant maps that will show climate impacts of affected communities. So making sure that those maps are up to date regularly, making sure that the public can easily access these maps, as well as partnering with community-based organizations to make sure these next two strategies, I'll click on them here. These two strategies are all about working with residents to make sure that the data that is being collected, triangulating that with the lived experience on the ground. And potentially that's through citizen science methods of engaging communities with the data collection and identifying problems to be solved through data collection and research. And then finally, training city staff who work with the city GIS databases, training them on how to best integrate equity, inclusion with the collection of data and with the sharing of the data. So I will stop sharing there. I think I saw maybe some hands up or maybe some items in the chat, but I'll lead us through a discussion. I can certainly pull these back up if we want to have those up while we discuss, but my first question for you all is, as we walked through these strategies, what was just one thing that maybe caught your attention, a word or a phrase, or maybe a whole strategy? What stood out to you as we just walked through those together? And if you could use the raise hand function again, I will call on you.
Can you put the screen back up again so we can see?
Yes, I will do that.
Thanks.
Great. And Kaylee, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I might have missed the beginning or maybe not heard fully. But I guess one, like a broad takeaway for me, it seems to be more on the like implementation side. Is that correct? Of like in implementing the climate action plan versus in this upfront process. Is that correct? That it's more equitable strategies towards the implementation phases versus when we're like talking to the community right now.
Yeah, I would say that that takeaway is probably accurate.
Okay, so I guess my question based off of that is, and it kind of relates to what Alex had brought up earlier, is how are we going to be equitably, reaching out to those communities and ensuring that the voices that are currently not in this room are being heard?
Yeah, great question. And one distinction I'll make with these strategies is that these are the strategies for the climate action plan to be implemented once the climate action plan is finalized. But then to your question, Kaylee, that's a great question. And we do have the community engagement plan that we're working with through the city. Like Kim said, later in the fall, when the draft climate action plan is released, how do we best share that with members of the community? How can we rely on all of you to help us disseminate that information? And Rob, I saw that you unmuted. Were you going to say something there?
Yeah, I was just adding on to what you just mentioned, our engagement plans. So once the draft plan is available to the public, we do plan to do some robust outreach, including going to community organizations that might let us reach those groups we don't typically talk to. So that is in our plan for this process. Patricia and I are going to be spending a lot of time going to meetings as well, and in different languages as well. We'll specifically target some meetings that are bilingual or Spanish focused. So that's certainly part of our plan moving forward here in the next few months.
Is that something that this task force has been or will be a part of in like crafting that plan? Is that something that you'll be asking us about, as like who and what communities and in what format to reach out to?
I think maybe not the whole group. We've had some informal We've had some smaller group discussions and we've gotten a sense of some of that. We're certainly listening. So if there is some groups that you recommend we reach out to, we want to hear that so we can make contact. And I think that's really important, is to make sure that we can cast the broadest net that we can.
Yeah, I think I just getting at my internal fear, like through this process, if we're going to be eliminating items up front before those community members have ever had a chance to weigh in, I guess that's kind of where I'm nervous. Specifically, that kind of was triggered when in the beginning slides where it was talked about that there was really no interest in any sort of like cultural or arts-based programs. And that just was kind of just raised a red flag to me. So I guess I'm just, want to be very cautious to make sure that before we slash any ideas permanently, that we have done a really good job of reaching out to those communities who are not traditionally heard.
Thank you, Kaylee. Mike, how about you? Oh, you're on mute, Mike, sorry.
Sorry about that. So as I look at these, we've got a lot of really positive kind of proactive strategies on equity. And I guess my question or observation is, I think we need to be looking at kind of the indirect equity impacts of a lot of the other strategies that may be negative in a certain sense. So I think, for example, and I'm not weighing in on whether it's right or wrong, but on a gas tax, for example, that will negatively impact folks, especially at the lower income levels that may need to get to their job via vehicle. I look at some of the housing impacts, for example, and if we were to ban, the installation of new natural gas lines, that increases the cost of housing. There's other strategies that do the same thing. So just an observation that it's not just these proactive, really positive equity strategies we have, but we need to look at all of our strategies in terms of that equity perspective and some of the indirect negative impacts some of those may have.
Yes, excellent point, Mike. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's an exciting part that we'll be tasking you all and the subject matter experts and city staff with when we get into those small groups focus teams of when strategies are reviewed, the equity impacts, as well as who will be responsible for implementation, as well as cost, those will be evaluated once we are able to break those down into the small groups. So thank you very much for that. You're definitely right. Alex, you've got your hand up. Sorry, Alex, you're on mute.
Sorry. I said I'm gonna sound like a broken record because I'm gonna keep like repeating the same question, and that is like, what strategies are y'all as people that have been hired, what strategies are you guys using to not drown out voices when it comes to equity? Because one of the most important things when talking about inequities is talking to people, talking to communities that are the most effective about issues, not talking to people who maybe read a book about inequities, but actually talking to the disparities and what they need. And I'm really curious to know like how you guys came up with this and how you guys will ensure that when voices are being drowned out by the majority, but they're the most impacted, how will y'all address that issue? I'm really curious.
Thank you, Alex. So again, the strategies came from the state of Oregon's climate equity blueprint. So a lot of the work was done by the state that we pulled from and put into the city level. And then as Rob mentioned, part of the draft climate action plan engagement in the fall with community engagement will be going to different groups, different neighborhood associations to get feedback, share information, and gather feedback later this year. Casey, you've got your hand up.
Sure. Thanks. A couple things that jumped out to me and were the point on data, just all the points on data. Historically, the city, we are just wrapping up a policing audit. And one of the big findings in that report, which several people on this call know, is the lack of availability of data. and not enough data gathering. So I think one of the things that the city struggles with kind of all around is the ability to both gather the data and then do something with it once we have it. And so I think that's going to be especially important for this. The other is, you know, I don't see anything on here about paying folks to take part in historically underrepresented communities. And that's a strategy that I'm actually simultaneously in the Northwest Climate Conference right now, and we just finished the session on climate justice and climate equity. And so in Seattle and King County and other areas where they have climate equity committees to implement these things, they will pay folks to take part in that. And so that's a strategy that I think definitely needs to be considered to pay for folks' time, especially when we want to hear what they have to say, because it's important. It lets them know that we value it. And, you know, it doesn't have to be, it's not millions of dollars. So it's something that the city could afford. So there's that. And then it was a point brought up in chat, and I think it's one that is Alex is kind of getting at too, is, you know, if we go out into the fall and we solicit this information or this, you know, feedback, then we'll be getting feedback from communities that didn't have a part in really creating the thing that they're getting feedback on. So it's something to be mindful of as we kind of move forward with that.
Great, thank you, Casey. And also in terms of compensation for folks for their time, great point. This is where, again, it can get exciting with the small groups of really adding some detail to some of these. So for example, there's kind of a vague strategy in its current form about following best practices for community engagement per the outline of the state of Oregon's climate equity blueprint. And one of the best practices, as you noted, is compensating people for their time for engagement. So this is where we can add some additional detail as we continue with this refinement process. Wendy, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just going to put a little finer point on Alex and Casey, which is this doesn't feel equitable to me that we're going to develop, that we have this blueprint and then we're going to go and ask for feedback in the fall. That's not equitable to me. And so we need to have a strategy of how we're going to incorporate and ask and incorporate from BIPOC communities, their perspective, their feedback, their priorities. And I think that's needed because otherwise this is a traditional, just a traditional way that we do things. We gather a task force, we have a group of people, we have, you know, surveys, and then we develop the plan. And then after we develop the plan, we go, oh, now we want your feedback. It just isn't, that's not equitable. So I strongly encourage that we do some work and have a very clear plan. Just putting a finer point to Alex, we have a plan in action for now and going into the fall, so that in the fall, when we look at the plan, it has incorporated the feedback of BIPOC and vulnerable communities, vulnerable members in our community. So I'm not happy with this process right now, because we're looking at it again from a traditional standpoint, which is after the fact. So I welcome other BIPOC members on this task force for their sense of it, but I just want to support Alex and putting a finer point to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Benny, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Wendy just put it as succinctly as it can be stated. You know, so often, and it may not even be intentional, but it's so often the case as what we're doing right now, where we are right now, is putting all this information together. And as Wendy just very eloquently pointed out, come this fall, here's what we're saying to the community. And the community has not been, the African-American community in particular, certainly the Pacific Island community in general, And then there's other aspects of the BIPOC community that is not visually and literally involved in this task force right as we speak here. You're going to end up putting together a strategy that has already been decided upon. And that's not acceptable. You know, between the language barriers that exist within this community, and I'm talking about the entire Salem community, with the COVID being as real as it is and still alive and well, people are reluctant to be out and or do certain things or even engage in these video conferences. We're just not taking, in this moment in time, a means and putting forth the effort to make this much more inclusive. And that's going to be a problem because you're going to end up doing what generally happens, whether it's at the legislative level, at the state, or if it's at the county, or now at the city, leaving out the people that's most vulnerable to this strategy that we want to implement that's going to impact every one of us. And that you know, Alex, Wendy, and Janice have been stating this consistently, and we're just kind of skipping over this because we want to get to the finish line. So that's my comments on this at this point.
Thank you, Benny. Hearing it loud and clear, that seems to be a sticking point with process that needs to be reevaluated. Let's see, I think we might have time for two or three more comments. So Kaylee, I see your hands up again.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add other than what Wendy and Benny had just talked about, but I was feeling something uncomfortable in my gut and I wasn't really eloquently saying it as well as you two have, but exactly that Alex, I felt, had raised some questions that maybe weren't being exactly answered, but specific strategies, such as what Casey mentioned, as far as paying individuals, or how are we in this process right now going to be planning to reach those communities that have our voices heard. And so I think Rob had mentioned that you have those strategies in place. I might ask that those do be brought to this entire group for consideration and our greater input, so that we can specifically start planning for those processes.
Thank you, Kaylee. Casey, your hands up again?
That's an accident.
Oh, okay. Thank you. John.
I'm in total agreement with what Wendy and Benny and Alex have said. The question is, it seems like we keep going back to, we have to have this done by fall. And my question is, do we have to have this done by fall? I mentioned early on that the Multnomah County is taking 2 years for outreach to develop its plan. So it makes sure that it is a representative plan for the entire community. And I feel like that if we still have this hard deadline for September, I don't think, I think we're not going to do this well.
Thank you, John. All right, I'm looking for, yes, Councilor Nordike.
Hi, I want to echo and support everything that Benny and Alex said, full stop. And in the chat, I had a couple recommendations to help close the equity gap. I have noticed that when it came to the Our Salem visioning process, the city staff made a point of visiting with communities of color to make sure that their input was taken into account. For example, as Benny knows, I remember, I think he and I were at the same NAACP meeting when Eunice Kim from the city planning office came to receive and solicit input from the NAACP chapter on the Our Salem visioning process. So I would invite our consultants to talk not only with the NAACP, but mano a mano and various other groups. And I'm sure I can help provide you with some names, and I'm sure other task force members have some names of local organizations too. A lot of these groups have regularly scheduled monthly meetings. And so if they haven't already met for the month of April, getting on their agenda ASAP would be a great way to address the concerns that Alex, Benny, and others have raised today.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Nordijk. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen really quickly. John, I see that your hand is still up. Did you want to add to that, or I think it might be a legacy? There we go. Great. All right. Thank you all very much for this point. Wendy, did you have your hand up? Sorry, I want to make sure we.
I did. I just want to reiterate that outreach and engagement to the BIPOC communities is different. So Benny and Alex know this very well. It is not about presentations. It's not about going to a meeting. It is about engaging and having conversations that is very different. So part of the strategy should be who is the right facilitator to help engage the communities for their feedback. So I just, again, we're consistently looking at it from a traditional standpoint. We go, we show up, we do a presentation, we get feedback. That's not how it works in the BIPOC communities. BIPOC communities are relationship oriented. And so a part of it is how you engage with them, how you build the trust that you genuinely want to incorporate their feedback and that they're going to be heard. And so I just want to emphasize that because I think it's a little bit outside of the box thinking for a lot of folks, because we're, again, used to a very general way of approaching getting feedback, and it looks different and feels different within the BIPOC communities. And so I just want to emphasize that with the strategies, let's consider how we engage and how we seek the feedback, because otherwise we're not going to get really what we're looking for, which is authentic, direct feedback from members of our community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. And as we're seeing today, continuing as business as usual or conventional modes of engagement, it's going to take a lot to revise these systems. So I appreciate everyone's input right now. I'm going to turn it to Patricia.
Yeah, I just, as one of the staff members for the city trying to implement this and push this process along, I appreciate all the comments. I'm wondering, since we have such a broad task force, if we can lean on some of you to help us with this outreach. Can you get us in your meetings, and can you be the facilitators for some of this, as having participated in the task force and hopefully being educated on some of these things? So it's not necessarily city staff coming and presenting, but being there as a support for you folks who are closer to some of these groups than we are.
That's awesome, Patricia. This is Wendy. That's exactly, I think Alex and Benny and myself, we have relationships, but there are others that we can also bring in to help us, because they are trusted leaders within the BIPOC community, and they understand how to engage. And so that really but that really also gets to, I think, a conversation of paying them for this service, because these are very busy, dedicated people. And I think compensation is important as we look for their support. Benny and Alex, feel free to add comments. I appreciate your leadership.
Yeah, I agree with what Wendy said. And another thing is also, if we want to be truly equitable, we're going to have to look at the survey and the questions, because surveys can be biased. A lot of questions, they already are intended to have a certain outcome. So we're definitely going to have that discussion when we do go to our communities about what are the intentions of this survey, what do we want to hear, or most importantly, what is this survey trying not to hear from the community?
That's a nice way of putting it, Alex. And Wendy, again, I appreciate your voice in this. And I appreciate what Patricia just asked of us in general, and for some of us specifically. Yes, it does require Alex, myself, and others here, as well as other organizations, to be able to come before our organizations and or our communities and lay out, look, this is not about dictating anything. This is about, even on our behalf, this is about saying, listen, community, these are things that's going to be happening. We've got a task force, and we've got a consulting firm that's leading the effort to bring about a positive change as we go down the road 10 years out. But we're not coming to you to say you should be on one side or the other. We want to understand what your heartfelt concerns are, and then be able to address that with this task force, providing the answers. And this consulting firm that's charged with trying to bring about this change, being there to both explain it in more details and to provide an honest, realistic assurance that the voices are being heard, that this is not pre-stacked against those who are going to be most adversely impacted.
Thank you, Benny. Tom, I see you've got your hand up.
Thank you. I posted this on the comment section too. Who set the deadline of the fall? Certainly not the council. That seems to me it's more of a staff issue, and understandably so. We got a task, we want to get through with it. But I will tell you that, and I'm sure, I don't know if Jose is here on the conference, but I know Vanessa is, and the city has been extremely concerned with equity issues that run through everything in the city, and we're trying to look at everything through an equity lens. And so all this stuff is totally apropos here. And it seems to me that it would be a good idea to slow it down a bit. We want to get it right for everybody in the city. We just don't want to get it right for the top level, however you want to look at that top level of people in the city. So what Wendy and Benny and Alex are saying is right on. And I think that the Virtus folks and the city staff ought to look at, can we push this out a bit? I mean, this is going to affect us for a long, long time. And if we can take a few more months to make sure we have input from people who will likely be most affected, as Benny and Wendy and Alex have said, I think we'll come up with the plan that is better for everybody.
Thank you, Tom. I'm just scrolling through to make sure I don't miss anyone who might have their hands up. Robert, I see that you've got your hand raised. Would you like to chime in?
Sure, just very briefly responding to Councilor Anderson's comment. I don't know precisely where the deadline, what the source is, but city staff, we work on behalf of the city council, and so it is certainly, we certainly made council aware that we're trying to make this in concert with the Our Salem process, which does have a December targeted deadline. But we're happy to work at whatever time frame under city council's direction we can. So we can talk more about that. So the deadline is variable and flexible depending on basically budget and city council's direction.
Thank you, Robert. Patricia, I see your hand is still up. Would you like to? No, okay. Okay, Ian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it might be worthwhile for us as a body to take at least an informal vote on this, or I want to make sure that city council is fully aware that we are supportive of a longer timeline. And with that, I imagine that there will be additional costs. I think it's important that we fully convey to the council that this is valuable, and that means that we are okay with the additional cost. doing it right costs money. Let's do it.
Thank you, Ian. Kim or Patricia, thoughts on potentially a quick poll to launch or an informal voting session?
We can certainly launch a poll maybe after the break, just on Zoom right here. Is that the kind of thing you were referring to, Ian?
That or a formal vote. I don't know if this task force actually takes formal votes, but if the counselors on the task force believe that this is sufficient, the conversation, then that's great. I just want to make abundantly clear that I think that we need to be aware that there's going to be a cost component, and regardless of the cost component, we're supportive.
Okay. And Tom, you gave a thumbs up. So you're, and Counselor Nordyke, do you also feel like you've heard enough of the will of the group, or would it help you to have a vote? I mean, this task force wasn't conceptualized to actually vote as far as I'm concerned, but we can certainly poll and show those results if that would help you.
Well, I'm certainly not seeing any opposition, but over the chat or just by gauging facial expressions, I'm not opposed to an informal poll. It probably takes seconds to confirm what I'm already suspecting. So, you know, I'm not seeing any opposition. So I think we need to take the time that we need to ensure that voices are heard. And I appreciate that and appreciate everyone's input today. It's been very educational.
Okay, great. I think we won't do a poll then. Patricia, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I guess as we're looking then at the upcoming months, it would be really helpful for us if members of the task force would send us your ideas for groups and when they meet and the contacts so that we can start getting those scheduled. And then also I would appreciate it if, as I mentioned, if one of you or somebody you know would be willing to lead the discussion. I'm not so convinced that we want to go and have everybody take the survey at this point, because I kind of feel like the survey was just to reflect the ideas that we had heard to date. So we might even take a step back and we have kind of the broader focus areas. We could, we could craft a discussion around that so that we maybe take a step back from that survey a little bit. So I'm just looking for some input from, not necessarily right now, but if you would email us about your ideas and when groups are meeting. I mean, obviously hopefully with more vaccines happening, we'll be able to meet again in person, which I think would really help the process as well.
Okay, great. This has been such a helpful conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and take a break. And we went over time, but that was great. We needed that. So we'll take maybe a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and Belina will have more to share with you about the strategy refinement. So let's rejoin at 10:30.
Great. All right. Thank you everyone for coming back. So we're going to make a slight adjustment to the agenda based on our previous discussion. We were going to, as you see in the agenda, we were going to review strategies that were flagged for removal, but that seems inappropriate at this time. So we'll table that discussion as we plan for an enhanced engagement process. And you have the document we sent late yesterday, so you'll have that for reference, and we can certainly revisit that, but we imagine strategies might look differently moving forward. So what we wanted to do maybe for the next 20 minutes or so is ask you some questions about the final climate action plan. So in terms of thinking through, our first workshop, we shared some example climate action plans, and we know that some of you have done a great job too of looking at other climate action plans, such as the Equitable Climate Action Plan from Oakland, California. Vancouver has a climate action plan that focuses on equity as well. So thinking about Salem's final climate action plan, we wanted to ask some questions about numbers of strategies and how to refine numbers of strategies as we move through this future process. So we know that you all looked at over 200, almost 230 strategies, and we recognize that a final climate action plan of that magnitude might not be that useful for implementation. So we wanted to ask any reactions to quantities of strategies you envision being useful for the city to implement in the final version. So any feedback there of what you imagine will be included?
Quantitative actions.
And it could be that it's an organic process like we had previously engaged in, of collecting hundreds of strategies and going through another refinement process. Ian, I see that you have your hand raised.
I'm less averse to quantity, but my concern is mainly quality. So the modeling that was done indicated that there would be a tripling of public transit ridership. And so if that's a desired outcome, then I think it needs to have a lot of individual goals within it. So increased frequency, increased coverage, which of course means increased revenue for the transit district, better sidewalks. I think a whole host of things fall underneath that. And I would be hesitant to limit the number simply because I think a goal that is as important as that needs to have a very holistic approach. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Ian. And Dylan, your question in the chat, how many umbrella categories? So there's about 7 action areas currently. Again, those might be revised. But Ian, to your point about not wanting to limit quantities, point taken there. Does anyone want to agree with that, or maybe share a counterpoint if you're really looking for a set number of strategies? John, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I think since I'm sort of an energy wonk guy for a lot of energy experience, I've sort of put the energy stuff into 3 buckets. I got electricity, I've got natural gas, and I've got transportation. So I'm just looking at it purely from an energy standpoint. In each of the buckets, I think that there is a different numbers of actions that are needed or required. And I'm assuming this is all with community acceptance with this outreach program, this expanded outreach program that we're going to do. But I mean, we can probably deal with electricity emissions in about 3 action items, depending on what those 3 actions. I think getting to the toughest nut is going to be transportation oil. That is going to be, so I agree with Ian. I wouldn't put a number necessarily. It's got to be coherent is what's more important. And it's got to make sure that you actually achieve that. I think the other, in terms of and then I think last we have what I call the natural gas bucket. And I think right now there's certain things that both the committee and I think the community needs. We have a lot of programs already out there. It's at issue. I mean, there's everything that has been suggested as a recommendation. There is a program out there already, and it's usually run by the Energy Trust, who is the entity who runs programs for our utilities, PGE and Northwest Natural. And so to me, it's a question that if we're looking at how do we reduce natural gas use, we should be looking at how can we use our existing programs more effectively. I think that's critical, and we should be bringing in the parties and working with neighborhoods and communities. And how do we do that? So going in a circular way, I'm getting to me, I don't think there's a set number that I'm worried about in terms of the action items. It's just that it's a question that it's the right actions.
Great. Thank you, John. In a second, Janet and Casey, I'll turn it to you. I'll just note that I'll move us from talking about quantities of strategies, and we'll move on from that discussion in a second. But Janet, how about you?
I think any number that we put out now would be kind of arbitrary. So I think what's really important is prioritizing. And I think prioritizing with broader, inclusive, diverse community input is really important. And if we want to follow the climate equity blueprint, on page 21, it recommends that you have data indicators on race, housing, jobs, income, education, health, and that if we want to follow the environmental justice, the Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force report from 2016, they recommend that we get data on race from the census, data on socioeconomic status from the American Community Survey, also done by the Census Bureau, school district data on race, free and reduced cost lunches. They suggest that the unit of analysis be the census tracts, and they also suggest that we map race, low-income households, environmental health risks, language translation needs, assets and community centers and media outlets, as well as pollution sources and natural disaster risk areas. So if we're gonna go, best practices, they've been laid out for us. And I, when I saw the agenda for this meeting, I thought we were gonna get some data on equity, and data on equity measures. And when I found out that we were just gonna kind of talk about strategies and intents, those intentions don't really matter unless they're measurable, so we can see, how we're doing on them, and also so we can have some accountability on how we're doing on those measures.
Great. Thank you, Janet. And I posted in the chat the link to the State of Oregon Climate Equity Blueprint. Casey, I see your hands up.
Yes, on purpose this time. I'll echo the remarks. I guess I don't need to say too much. I agree with what Ian said. I'm less concerned with an overall number of strategies. Obviously 211 or 230 would seem like a lot, but I'm less concerned with that than the themes and the goals and the targets. What I would really like to see as we come away from this is what are our 8, 9, 10 goals and targets, what are our indicators, what are the metrics, how can we look back at this, what's our baseline going to be, what are we achieving, and then what are the strategies, how can we, I would like that the strategies kind of be dynamic so that if we're under or over our targets that we would be able to adjust, rather than just say, well, we have these 200 strategies that we have to kind of keep going with. So whether it's renewables or green buildings or transportation or waste or nature or any of the other overarching things, I think are more important in how we set our goals within those than it is to the strategies to achieve those goals.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Thanks for the point about allowing for some iterativeness and ability of the strategies to evolve over time as needed to fit the community needs. Let's take one more question or one more comment from Ken, and then we'll ask a different question here. So Ken, how about you?
If I can get unmuted. I think it's going to be important to identify clearly which strategies the city has responsibility and ability to affect, because there are a lot of strategies that the city will be dependent upon that others will be implementing, but it will not be the city's primary responsibility. So if those could be highlighted in some way, and I agree with folks that to make sure that there are measurable and outcomes. I think that's very important, but we need to distinguish between those that the city has direct influence on and those that have influence on the city's ability to meet greenhouse gas objectives.
Great. Thank you, Ken. You must have been channeling my brain for the next question, because that's what I wanted to ask everyone about. Of when you envision the final climate action plan, is this a plan that you see that only city actions are responsible, or the city is the only responsible party in the climate action plan? Or is this a community action plan where certain groups or organizations, or, as we've mentioned, chariots, and Northwest Natural Energy companies are responsible for certain strategies? Looking for some feedback from you all. Is this a city action only plan, or is this a broader community action plan? And I'll defer to Robert here for a minute.
I don't know if defer is the right answer, the right word to use. So I looked multiple times through all 211 potential strategies, and there are clearly ones in which I think the city, through city council, city staff, would be in the lead. But there are others that we would be in support that should also, I think, be included in the climate action plan, because whether you're in a lead role or support role, they need to be identified and incorporated into the strategies and for implementation. There are others that are just outside of anything we could possibly contribute to that should be kept if they contribute to greenhouse gas to be complete. But again, in my analysis, my view, because implementation is a lot with us, are we in the lead or are we in support? And it wasn't always clear, actually. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. And I see a couple of comments in the chat about it being a community-oriented plan where it's not just a strict city plan. And let's see, John and Casey, I see your hands are up. I'm just going to scroll through and make sure I'm not missing anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. Scrolling. Okay. Great. Ian, how about you?
I am not completely opposed to a community action plan. I do have a concern, though, that if it's too broadly focused, then nothing will get accomplished. I think the city, this is a city climate action plan. We as a transit district, just as an FYI, we're undertaking our own climate action plan here in the next little while. And so we will, of course, be 100% supportive of whatever the city comes up with. We'll need to partner on a lot of things. And I think it's worthwhile to say, as was pointed out by Mike, that in Beaverton's climate action plan, that, this is under this jurisdiction versus the other. But I would hesitate to lump everything all together, because I think this should serve as a guide for what the city can and should do, principally.
Thank you, Ian. Based on your comments and what we're hearing so far, it sounds like it would be helpful in the final climate action plan if there was an indicator that showed who is responsible for who and what the city will be supporting versus what the city is in direct control of. Casey, how about you?
Yeah, thanks. So again, with what everyone else is kind of saying, I don't think there's a way to be successful unless there's a robust public-private partnership involved to move forward, to make sure that the needs of both the business community are met, but as well as the needs of all of the people that are in the city. And like Ian was just saying, I think a good tool for using that is a responsibility matrix, or the RACI model that I think a lot of project management folks are at least probably familiar with, to indicate, who the responsible folks, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed, and who the primary stakeholders or process owners on these things are going to be. I think that could be useful. It probably would mean less to the average citizen reading it. What is this big grid? But for the process owners themselves, I think it could be something to take. And whether it's that, one thing we haven't talked about is the county's role from a regional perspective. They do a lot of work. There are a number of businesses, like the Taproot just comes to mind, restaurant, who works with county environmental services to meet certain goals and thresholds to receive funding. And so there's a lot of excellent work that they do that we could partner with as well. So definitely a community oriented approach.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, in thinking about the strategies, of course, I would like a set of strategies where the city is the lead, so they are taking, direct responsibility of saying we will do X or Y, Z. But I do like also having a component that's community oriented, so that you're going to have the community more of a buy-in to the whole process, and not just be left behind after this climate action plan is completed. So in communities like Corvallis, where they have a very strong sustainability group, I think it's called Sustainable Corvallis, which has been around for 20 plus years, they are working independently but can work together with the city on actions that are, promote sustainability overall. And it may not all of their actions may have a lot. They have like dozens of things they work on. And some may have marginal effect to greenhouse gases, but they have other complementary benefits. So some of the strategies that we went through in our list that may have been dropped off in that list that Verta sent out yesterday, it may be worthwhile having those in our back pocket for those kind of community-oriented strategies where the community feels that they can make their contribution to climate action. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mike. John, how about you?
Yeah, I guess I'm in bucket mode. To make a plan work, and I've drafted a global warming plan for the state, is you actually need champions. You need to be very clear who's doing what. And so that, so whatever action's in there, it's got to be very clear who's in charge and how's it going to be doing and who's responsible. I see 4 sets of city actions. One is lead by example. And I think that's central regardless, and that's, decarbonizing all the city's assets and operations over a reasonable timeline. You start by being the leader, by showing how it can be done. 2 is taking actions within city authority that will reduce emissions citywide. 3 would be enabling others to reduce emissions, making it easier for others. And 4, which is where I think you bring in the community, is partnerships. I think in the long run, this has got to be by persuasion. And so that, this is bringing in businesses, utilities, state government, our major users, communities, neighborhoods, that they're part of the programs. And then, quite frankly, I can imagine this is beyond the community. There's so much outside of the city control that actually will determine whether or not you make your targets. Those at least should be acknowledged.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I appreciate your bucket mindset today. Some great ideas that you've shared here. Now, again, I apologize. I have to hop off for another meeting today, but again, I just want to thank you all for your time and your insights and your feedback, and for getting us ready to engage in a deeper, more meaningful level. So I appreciate you all, and I will turn it back to Kim for some more questions, I think. So I'll see you later, and thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks, Melina. I want to ask a follow-up question to what you just shared, John. That was very helpful, those 4 buckets. And this question of jurisdiction, and I wanted to ask specifically Ian and Wendy, and if there's anyone else from and Connor's here from Northwest Natural. So if the plan included, it was a community-based plan, like the strategies that you've seen so far, there are some that pertain to something that PGE would need to execute, or there are several, of course, in the transportation sector that Chariots would need to execute. And I wonder if you could tell us how that feels for your organizations. Like, does that create problems for you that you have basically a to-do list that's in, the city's document and not your own organization's document?
So this is Wendy, and John, as many of you know, is an energy expert here, and he's well aware that from a PGE perspective, we're already working in partnership with the city and other local partners on energy initiatives. And so for us, when he highlights the partnerships, that was really important because those are happening as we occur. We're already moving forward on working towards a net zero carbon emissions goal. And so we have a lot of discussions already occurring with the Councilor Anderson and Mayor Bennett and others about how we can do that. So it doesn't feel like an added burden. It feels more like it's very important to identify, I think what John has repeatedly said, which is what are the existing programs? What are the existing partnerships? And how do those programs and partnerships move forward towards the same goals? And I think we're all looking towards the same goals. So from a PG perspective, it is not an added burden because that work is already occurring.
Okay, great. Thank you, Wendy. Ian or Connor, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I'd just like to echo a little bit of what Wendy said, which is that you'll certainly find a very willing partner with Northwest Natural. This is something that we are working on and creating these partnerships, and we have some programs that we could certainly do work with the city to roll out more here in the Salem area. But we also have some new offerings that we're working on, and hopefully can work with the city to make sure that those fit the needs specifically here.
Okay.
For Chariots, I think Chariots is in a unique position because while we operate the public transit in the region, we don't actually own or maintain the infrastructure on which we operate. And so the city, the county, they own the streets, the signalization, all those kinds of things. And so for us to be able to increase the speed or the flow of buses, I think we need to have a true partnership there. We recently secured some grant funding from the federal government, and we're partnering with the city of Salem and the county to do some signal preemption or prioritization, which allows buses to move through lights instead of stopping a 40-foot, multiple ton vehicle, which just slows down everyone. So those kind of things, I think, have to be a partnership. I think in order to get a tripling of ridership, according to the model, there needs to be additional revenues. We're statutorily preempted from doing that, at least for a little while now. And so having some financial skin in the game from the city, I think, is paramount. Whether that takes the form of a utility fee or I don't know what that looks like, but I think if the city of Salem is really serious about investing in public transit, there needs to be an investment in public transit. So I view those as two different things. So we're happy to work with, but I still think there remains a great deal of work that the city needs to do.
Okay, thank you, Ian. That's helpful. Okay, well, it's I guess we're getting close to moving into our discussion with Ecotone Analytics. I just wanted to ask a question about, we have discussed adding a set of qualitative indicators on the strategy list. And we've seen this in other climate action plans, and you may have noticed it too. So that, for example, in the final table of strategies, there may be a column that lists co-benefits that the strategy would have. And those might be, for example, co-benefits in public health or environmental quality, the local economy, mobility choice, and of course, community equity. So I wanted to just ask for any thoughts you may have if those 5 that I just read off sound right to you, if there are any other specific kinds of qualitative indicators you would like to see on the final strategy list. Janet?
So I'm assuming maybe in the next meeting that we have, we're going to see exactly how the strategies relate to reducing greenhouse gases, because I think one reason that we need a community climate action plan is to reach those goals to reduce greenhouse gases. So I'm looking forward to that. In terms of the indicators, I think there was on the survey, there was a comment about how we should kind of separate equity from what's actually reducing greenhouse gases, because some of the equity strategies don't reduce greenhouse gases. And I think that we read a few really great, I'm thinking of like Milwaukee, Oregon's climate action plan that had like things that were color coded and they had symbols, right? And so they indicated like, did this strategy, you know, reduce greenhouse gases in the short term? Did it, you know, reduce greenhouse gases in the long term? Did it relate to like resiliency? I like that, and there was also usually like an equity, like a kind of an equity symbol as well. I think health makes a lot of sense. So I think, you know, kind of taking those as a good template would, you know, make a lot of sense.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other thoughts? Kaylee?
Yeah, I was just going to I don't really have any suggestions in terms of like what actually to classify, but just in terms of for education purposes, I know we talked about this early on with just the amount of who is like in support or, you know, not in support of this climate action plan, but using those categories as a way to kind of to educate people who are just glancing through to show the co-benefits of everything, I think is really important, because when you know, just going through that survey, you might be looking at, say, adding a bus lane or whatever, you know, whatever the category is, and not actually realize the co-benefits of that. So I'm just kind of commenting in support that as much as we can to use that as like an education, looking holistically at some of these measures, I think would be really important.
That's a great point. Thank you. Any last comments on which co-benefit indicators you'd like to see in the final plan? Okay. Well, thank you for this added discussion. This was very helpful. We're going to switch gears now, and I would like to go ahead and introduce our next speakers. As part of this project, as it was initially conceived, the city had asked for a cost-benefit analysis to be done on some of the strategies of the plan. And so we have brought in a team of economists to do this part of the project. They're called Ecotone. They're out of Minneapolis. And we've had a lot of discussion internally with the city's project team about how best to address this, because as you might imagine, it's not feasible to do a cost-benefit analysis on 211 strategies. And so what we've decided to do for process, understanding that the city council is the body that will ultimately approve this climate action plan. And of course, it's the city council who approves the city's budget. And so ultimately, they are the individuals who most need the cost-benefit information. And so we will be meeting with the 3 counselors on this task force next week, Counselors Anderson, Nordyke, and Gonzalez. And we will be talking with them about a list of strategies that fall only in the city's jurisdiction. And we will be asking them to select 10 of those strategies for a cost-benefit analysis. And we're fortunate to have the Ecotone team with us because they have a very holistic approach to doing this economic analysis. And they're going to explain a little bit about that. But the results don't just show dollars, they also show costs and benefits and how they accrue to different members of the community. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Tim Roman and Will Nielsen from Ecotone. And I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Kim. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking some time during this meeting for us to share our piece of the project. Kim, would it be possible that I can share my screen so we could walk through the short deck that we have? Can you see my screen? Can you see all of my screen? Or are you seeing just the presentation?
Just the presentation.
Okay, good. Well, I'll let Will introduce himself, but a little bit about Ecotone. We are a Minneapolis, Minnesota-based social and environmental analytics firm. We've been in business since 2015. We serve clients in business, government, and philanthropy. In a nutshell, we use research and cost-benefit analysis to understand social and environmental impacts, the social and environmental impact value of our client strategies, and like Kim said, to whom those benefits accrue. Some of the common thematic areas of our work include climate action sustainability, as you can see on the screen, health equity, community health, social equity, racial justice. We do a lot of work in workforce development and the future of work. And so this is kind of probably where Kim was characterizing us as having kind of maybe a little bit more broad perspective on the social impacts of climate change and GHG than maybe folks that are just focused on environmental outcomes. We have a pretty standard process of collaboration with clients that follows this, kind of typical process where we work through logic models, do the cost analysis, do the research that shows what are those strategies that are creating outcomes and how do we value those outcomes with a high level of evidence. And then we identify the key performance indicators that are those signals or predictors of being on track to achieve that value. So I'm going to pause there.
Just for a second, sorry. We've had a request. Could you put your slides on full presentation mode?
Yeah, that's why I was wondering if you were seeing like part of it or the whole thing. I don't know. Let's see if I can do that. I mean, I should probably know how to do this. View.
Yeah, view slideshow.
Screen. Oh,
No,
view slideshow. Gotcha. Oh, I forgot you can see that stuff. Okay, so here's a go to Minneapolis. Here are the things that we do. And I'll just to introduce myself, I'm Tim Roman. I'm one of the principals and co-founders. But now I'm going to turn it over to Will Nielsen, who's our lead economist, and he's going to walk through the rest of the deck.
Great. Hi, all. Great to be connected. As Tim said, I'm Will, economist with Ecotone. So working through a lot of these cost-benefit analyses that we'll be developing over the next couple months here. So I will just continue with the slide deck here, giving a little bit of an overview of what our process with Salem will look like for this project. So as Kim mentioned, we'll be focusing in on 10 prioritized strategies. And so with each of those strategies, there's a few key components of those we like to highlight as being features that are prominent as a part of the Ecotone process. So one of those is monetization beyond financial outcomes. And so what we mean by that is just that we are including monetization of social outcomes and environmental outcomes. That could relate to things like improved health, various components of improved well-being via mental health and so forth, as well as the many different components of environmental benefits that could potentially be generated as well. So I know we've been talking about the greenhouse gas emission reductions as being one of those prominent ones, but there's various other aspects that we expect to become a part of several of these strategies, including elements of air quality, potentially water quality, depending on the strategy selected, and so forth. So also a big part of our work throughout each of these cost-benefit analyses is working to incorporate this equity lens as we move through these projects. An organization that we like to align ourselves with is called the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. If you haven't come across them before, I recommend checking out their website. They promote an equitable evaluation approach, which in this case, and for much of our work, refers to how we engage with the potential beneficiaries of a strategy and minimizing the extractive nature of the evaluation process overall, while creating that strong understanding of the benefits and impact that are still generated. And so the last component I'll touch on here is also, and in alignment with this equity element, is understanding to whom do the benefits accrue. And so while we will be noting the various benefits that will result from a particular strategy, we'll also be looking to understand who is benefiting or who is receiving that flow of value from each of those outcomes that we monetize. We can do the next slide then. Great. And so as we're moving through these projects, we wanted to highlight a couple of the big tools that we use, as well as some of the research and work being done in this space that heavily informs our work in this cost-benefit analysis world as well. So one of the big ones that I'm sure many of you are familiar with already too, but is with regard to the social cost of carbon. This refers to the estimated value attached to a ton of carbon emitted. And so with that, we understand the potential global implications and global costs that may be incurred as a result of each ton of carbon emitted. Within that, there's many different approaches to the measurement of it and scoping in terms of who is bearing those costs versus who is emitting those costs. Those kind of details are the types of things we'll be taking into consideration as we move through our process as well. I'll briefly touch on a couple of these others here that you may be familiar with already too, one of which is the Social Progress Index, which serves to help aggregate some of the major components of society in general to help understand and help track how cities and states and countries even are doing along various indicators that together signal collective social progress. And so we note here some of the major environmentally related indicators that come into play and may be a part of our analysis as well. Another tool is referred to as the donut economics. That one you may have been seeing more of as well too, and it's something that we've been continually researching as well. But it creates this great framing for understanding an ecological ceiling of society and for the world as a whole, as well as these social foundations, which moving between those two pieces, the ecological ceiling and the social foundation, is that kind of sustainable world that we're working to achieve, and that we hope that these strategies are helping to achieve as well. The last one here we'll touch on, and there are others as well too, but for the sake of time, we can keep moving. But one of which is the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative. This one we've been using increasingly as more often as well too, as a way to reference how climate change, climate adaptation is connected to various components of social vulnerabilities and what that can mean for the different implications for different strategies. So in the later slides here, we'll touch on a couple of those implications as well. Great. And now, so this here is one of those tools that is really a core feature of an ecotone analysis, and this is the logic model. Many of you may be familiar with what the logic model is and what it consists of already, but we wanted to note it here just for its central role in as we use it at the start of every analysis to help understand everything that's going on within a strategy and what those inputs are on the left-hand side column and how those inputs are utilized in different activities. And from those activities leads to a certain set of outputs. And so those outputs tend to be those countable units that are tied to those activities. From those outputs then is the change generated. And that's what we're all working towards with these various strategies, as well as that being an area where Ecotone spends a lot of our time, and where, as Tim mentioned, a lot of this, the research process comes into play, where we're looking to link together these different outcomes to understand what's that causal change that's being created as a result of the unique inputs and activities associated with the strategy. And so For each strategy that we work through, we'll be developing one of these logic models at the outset. And with those logic models, that becomes the map of our analysis as we recognize all those different types of impacts, positive or negative, that could result from a given strategy. And from those, we then move from what is noted here as more of a qualitative framing of a potential strategy and taking that into the quantified work where we start attaching that dollar value to these various components. And so to help give a little better understanding of what this looks like in practice and what this will mean for some of our work with the city of Salem here, we wanted to give a little example. And so working with the Veritas team and Patricia and Rob, we came up with this strategy, which was highly ranked by both the task force as well as when it went out for a community vote as being something that would be important, as well as being one that is ranked as being or potentially very high greenhouse gas impact as well. So this strategy is referred to as creating the plan for having EV charging stations installed at all multifamily residences. And so to give a sense of what this looked like, we did a little preliminary research digging into the types of studies that have been conducted within this space and how that can inform the types of activities that might be needed, the types of outputs that we could probably expect, as well as the types of outputs that we think will be important to track going forward as potential key performance indicators to help understand how the strategy implementation is going and how effective the work has been conducted thus far. And then from there, the outcomes, which are noted as being those research-based components, as we mentioned, these become those pieces that we start to really latch on to for those monetized benefits. So I know there's a lot of text on the screen here, but as we read from top to bottom within that outcomes column, you start to get a sense of what types of impact pathways, as we call them, that we'll be working to help lay out and assign to each strategy. So in this case, some of the prominent outcomes that we've seen associated with this type of strategy include, the first and maybe the most obvious is just figuring out ways to support increased EV adoption. We've come across some interesting studies already that show what the DCFC or the really high speed charging stations mean for areas and how they can potentially stimulate adoption of electric vehicles just by knowing that having these high-speed charging stations as an option can make the purchase of an electric vehicle seem that much more viable. From there, we start to get into, as we move down that outcomes column, you start to see how many different links in the chain start to be developed and how we start to map out those different outcomes. So for example, here we start to see what studies have looked into with regard to the fuel savings from adopting an electric vehicle, the potential reduced vehicle maintenance costs that come from that. So those types of outcomes are still isolating those, kind of traditional financial metrics where we're looking at things like break-even timelines and payback periods during which perhaps the vehicle owner may be realizing some cost savings that may be countered by potentially higher cost of acquiring an electric vehicle. But then as we move down that column still, we start to see some of those other bigger implications that start to ripple out into various types of environmental outcomes as well as social outcomes. So one of the common ones that we were coming across within this space is aspects of air quality and what that can mean for the different types of health implications for people living in the area. For us, those types of recognition of those types of health outcomes often become very prominent components to our analyses as we start to see or how health can manifest within a person's life, but also the cost implications that come from that. And that can be in various forms, from changes in both direct healthcare expenditures, but also things like work productivity, absenteeism, or presenteeism. And so pretty quickly we start to see there's a lot of ripple effects that often come out of many of these types of interventions. So while we like to note that there are many different connections and linkages between all these different outcomes, a lot of times this logic model helps us break down what all those linkages start to look like, and what in a perfect world we'd be able to monetize and fully understand the full scope of impact that results from that. However, as a part of the process, and as many of you probably know, there's constant data limitations that restrict our ability to attach a robust estimate to the dollar value that may be tied back to some of these strategies. So within these logic models, we like to note the full universe of potential outcomes, good and bad. But then from there, a filtering process begins, where we start looking at what's the strength of the evidence. We use levels of evidence of causality to understand the strength of the research in place to help build these different linkages within the logic model. And from there, we can start recognizing what's in that right-hand column there, with aspects of reduced health expenditures, the implications of reduced household cost burden, potential valuations on improved quality of life. So as we work our way towards that column, you start to see what that can mean for individuals, but also as we've seen in some of the research here, some of the broader implications beyond just the individual or the household level. As in some cases we saw with some of the at least initial research that's out there that's tied to electric vehicles, there's many arguments around the elements of increased local economic activity, what that can mean for both local businesses as well as potential tax revenues that start to be fostered as more economic activity from local electric power generation will stay local in that case, rather than in many cases, depending on the supply chains utilized with like gasoline based, it may mean that much of the expenditures quickly leave the local community, in which case some of that economic activity takes place in other places rather than staying within the city as many would hope. So with that, maybe we can jump to the next slide there too. Tim, please feel free to add too.
Well, Will, I just texted you a question from the chat.
Okay.
So that's in your text if you want to address that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe, and maybe if we jump to the next slide, we start to get into that too. So it looks like one of the questions that came in was understanding who benefits from these different types of outcomes. And so that after we've built this logic model and we've started to identify what those monetized outcomes might be, what those benefits or costs may be, from there, then we start to look at kind of slicing up those outcomes and saying what amount of each outcome will accrue to each stakeholder that is potentially engaged. So within this slide, this is just to note that this process varies for every strategy depending on the types of variables that are important to that given outcome. But it is an essential component to the whole cost benefit process, because through that we start to see not only who is benefiting, or who in this case perhaps an intended beneficiary may be, but also in many cases as a part of these projects we start to see who is actually strongly benefiting from a particular intervention that may not have previously even known they were benefiting from that work. And so that serves as a valuable way to help foster new types of conversations, develop potential partnerships, as well as connect to different funding opportunities as well, depending on the strategy involved. So with that, I'll briefly just note that this little Excel table that's in the bottom left there, that serves to outline an example of what the cost-benefit analysis might look like as we've moved through the full process. So within the top column there, you see what we would also call a social return on investment, or a cost-benefit ratio, which is to say that for this example here, there was $4.90 in benefits for every $1 spent on that particular strategy. But those benefits, as I'm describing, can get allocated across several different stakeholders. So below that, you see 4 prominent stakeholders that all share a piece of the pie in this case. In many cases, we'll see that the government or taxpayers in some form will often be a prominent beneficiary, whether that's through increased tax revenues or through cost savings, depending on the folks that may be engaged with a particular strategy. In the example that's provided there, that's a healthcare-oriented initiative, which is creating benefits for Medicare and Medicaid eligible participants who, through reduced use of healthcare resources, are saving money for Medicare and Medicaid, of course, as well as creating health benefits for themselves, as we see with the $1.64 in benefits for every dollar invested, but also for private insurers in that case, as well as what's referred to as provider community contributions, or otherwise considered uncompensated healthcare use as a result of savings. But so with that framing, I guess within the orange box there, we noted a few of the variables that are likely to be used to help inform who the beneficiaries may be and how much they may benefit as a result of this EV charging station strategy. So one of the examples that we noted and thought would be interesting to bring up was with regard to understanding vehicle use rates by location of charging station. So one of the elements that we'd want to take into account is where the EV charging station is being located, at what multifamily residences, and where in Salem those would be taking place. And this is as a result of, in the upper right-hand corner, you see a little map there, which happens to be a map of Salem, but the figures included within that map come from that Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative that we referenced earlier. So you see within that map and in the highlighted census tract that's noted, one of the variables that is accounted for is the rate of, or percentage of folks within that tract who do not have access to a vehicle. So as we're considering a strategy that is vehicle oriented, we'll want to be considering the proportion of folks around that charging station that are prepared to be able to take advantage of that benefit as well. So those types of variables will become important for us, as well as we note several other bullet points here that would potentially be taken into consideration. For example, if it's an affordable housing, multifamily residence, then we start to get a sense of the income of the users of the charging station, as well as noted within the example within the spreadsheet boxes there, we note elements of Medicaid and Medicare eligibility as a way to help understand how government may be benefiting in certain ways, as well as healthcare utilization. So there's quite a few different ways that may potentially come into play with each strategy as we seek to understand all the different ways to potentially parse out the different stakeholders and recognize what value is accruing to them. This process, much like the monetization process itself, is one that is continually receiving research as we seek to understand how different stakeholders are benefiting. One that has become increasingly common within our research is understanding the benefits that flow to the second generation or children of users of the charging station in this case. as research continues to be developed within these spaces to help understand how other stakeholders start to benefit, that's something that we'll be seeking to continually account for as we move through these different strategies. So I hope that kind of gets at the question that was shared. As much as possible, we like to work on incorporating, local data to help recognize when different beneficiaries, whether that's by race or ethnicity or socioeconomic status, come into play. Oftentimes we'll leverage things like the American Community Survey to help recognize kind of baseline figures that are in place within a given locale.
Oops. Oh no. And scene. Sorry, Will.
No. Yeah,
Catch you up.
Yeah, so that kind of gives a sense of, the ecotone approach and a little bit of our thinking and the tools that inform our thinking as we will be moving into the cost benefit analysis for these 10 strategies.
So let's open it up for any questions for Will and Tim, questions about their approach. I wonder if any of our city councilors might help to enlighten us a little bit about how you go about using this kind of information when it comes to taking votes on the city council. Tom?
Thanks. The first thing we will do is have a work session, and it'll be just the counselors and probably the folks from Ecotone and staff members, and we'll go through the report and in depth, and counselors will ask a bunch of questions. Some of these sessions, work sessions, we have the public comment, others we don't. My suspicion is this would be a one, well, I don't know. The mayor decides whether we have public comment or not at each meeting. But we will get the full report well before the work session, and we'll have our comments then.
Great, thank you. Janet, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I expected more equity variables from what I heard at the very beginning of the presentation. Medicaid is the only kind of equity variable that I heard. So I was wondering if you were also looking at kind of race and socioeconomic status. Also, it's a bit hard to comment on until I see an example of what kinds of projects you're saying are cost effective and what kinds of projects you're saying are not cost effective, and also I'd be interested in, the kind of trends that you've seen over time in terms of, what kinds of projects tend to be more cost effective, what kinds of projects tend to be less cost effective using your metrics. And I'm particularly interested in how cost-effective equitable projects are, and if we can kind of put those together in a really kind of useful way, or do you find it's more of like a trade-off, like you have to kind of like pay more for equitable projects, something like that.
Great question, Janet. Appreciate that. In terms of cost effectiveness, and Tim, feel free to jump in too. Since we've worked across a variety of sectors and a variety of different programs, I suppose, that come into play, the extent of cost effectiveness can also vary, although I think in terms of our work, given its orientation towards social outcomes, in many cases is geared towards equitable initiatives in its own right. So that becomes a common feature of all of our projects, just given the nature of our approach and the focus on social aspects. So there, oftentimes we are using an assortment of different equity indicators, I would say, that start to come into play and become more or less prominent depending on the type of strategy implemented. As an example, recently we have focused a lot on elements of racial disparities, and with a large focus on the wealth gap has been a big focus of ours in understanding aspects of entrepreneurship and how that can serve as a tool for increasing wealth within, in this case, with Black-owned businesses around the Minnesota region. Although we have also referenced other ways of understanding both, correct me if I'm using the right term here, Tim, domain and scale of equity as a means to recognize how communities are performing across different aspects of equity. And so that includes elements of both like mental and physical health at an individual level, which is something that we note as being a common component to a lot of the cost benefit analyses, given it's readily monetizable in this case. But that extends through various layers of, let's see, looking at aspects of environmental health, which I think we've seen will be an important component for this work with Salem, as well as aspects of broader like institutional conditions and societal conditions that start to come into play, and how each of these layers all start to interact. And so this gets to a great point that I think we often come to as in later stages of our project too, is just how, as a part of our work within the cost benefit analysis, we like to align it with community indicators that are being probably pushed as a result of the impact that's being supported by a given strategy, or create that direct alignment and show where there's alignment with different equity indicators. That could extend across, depending on if there's certain local community indicator sets that are most important for Salem. Those are things we can make sure to align the strategies and the cost benefit analysis with, so that there's recognition of how the kind of micro level changes that are being supported by a given strategy are really, once broadened across a large scale, start to move the needle on bigger macro level changes that drives that bigger picture of what equity can look like. But Tim, please feel free to jump in on that one too.
I would just say, in addition to that, just disaggregating the population data for a given geography as well. And I know, like the Medicaid signal is just one of many of the signals that can come out of disaggregated data as research shows who's impacted by a given strategy. So hopefully, it's not misleading to only have like just our one example in the deck. We don't want you to think that that's the only signal that we're tracking, that there are a number that come out of the research as we research each of the strategies.
Thank you for those explanations, Will and Tim. Ken, you have your hand up.
Yes. Did I hear correctly that you're analyzing only 10 strategies? Or was that a mistake on my part?
That's correct, because we have budget limitations. This is as you can tell from Will's answer, it's a very involved process, and they do a lot of research on each one. There's a whole range of things that they have to consider. So because of the time intensity, we had to choose a small number of strategies for them to analyze. So we decided on 10.
So the follow-up would be, who chooses the 10?
Yeah, I explained
and how
that.
are they chosen?
Yeah, I explained that at the beginning of the presentation. We've had a lot of conversation about that, and we've decided that what makes the most sense is to have the city councilors choose the 10, because they will ultimately be voting on them. So we'll be meeting with them next week to decide on those 10. Mike.
Right, let me unmute. So this whole discussion reminds me of something that Portland Metro did in 2013 and 2015, where the state mandated them to come up with a plan to reduce greenhouse gases. They were pretty focused on just transportation. They weren't looking at energy. They weren't looking at, landfills or anything like that. It was just a transportation-focused one. And they did something very similar where they were developing the benefits the benefits not just to greenhouse gas reduction, but things like, and things I put in the chat here, public health, fewer traffic fatalities, the effect of the economy, and how strategies affect household budgets. And I like the fact that it's both broad-based, like how's the whole economy affected by the strategy, but also individually based, like, and I think that gets to the equity. How is this going to affect people's household budgets? Yep. So I'm not saying that we adopt what they do. I'm just saying it's useful to see how they focused their approach to be both region-based, but also down to individual households and things that households care about, like health and cost out of their pocket. So I'm hoping that whatever Echo Analytics does can do something similar, so people can relate to these outputs. Because I found the presentation very hard to relate. And I'm an analytical person, but I still like to have something explained to me, like how does this help? How does this help with health? How does this help with household budgets? And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mike. Any response to that, Tim or Will?
No, that's great guidance, and sorry we didn't lively up the presentation a little bit more, but those are exactly the things that we look at. We love looking at household cost burden and the percentage of spend in the burdens on households. So we'll look at that Portland example, but that's our language. That's the kind of analysis that we do. That's the kind of language that we use. And those are the kind of effects that we're interested in discovering.
Great, thanks, Tim. John.
Yeah, there's a lot of slop in these estimates, and this has nothing to do with the quality of the researcher. How do you handle uncertainty and sort of range of estimates?
Well, I can let Will take that, but we acknowledge uncertainty, and we rank. When we look at when we do our lit review, we rank levels of evidence. So if there's a really strong, multi-RCT meta-analysis finding, that's weighted more strongly in the analysis than things that are quasi-experimental or not, or simply peer-reviewed. Journals that haven't gone through RCT yet. So we follow kind of a typical epidemiological practice of looking at those, kind of like that pyramid of level of evidence. So that's how we classify and integrate some of that. All economists and economics are really good at kind of like identifying gaps in the data and then identifying the assumptions that are needed to leap those gaps. So as part of our deliverables, we're always talking about uncertainty. We're talking about where there's gaps in the data or where new data would be needed going forward to tighten those things up. There's one other thing I wanted to say. It's slipping my mind right now, but that basically that kind of a typical economist approach of knowing that there's incomplete data and identifying how we're doing the methodology, kind of sitting next to it. So that would be my answer for that.
Just add too that for some of those key variables that come into play for a given strategy, we'll do sensitivity testing around that to recognize how flexible those estimates might end up being in reality.
Great, thank you. Robert.
Yes, following on John's comment, the sensitivity analysis and caveats and assumptions and all of that goes into modeling, whether it's economic or hydro and hydraulic or whatever, tends to get lost in the verbiage. But if the result in a table is down to the nearest penny, it implies a certain level of precision that may not actually exist. So I'm wondering, even just the most basic presentation of the data, you can show a range that, we expect, the benefit for this, whatever's in your row, $1.80 to $2.10, or negative 55 cents to positive 55. That gives you a much better idea of the levels of uncertainty in this analysis and to some degree the risks in undertaking different actions.
If we have this conversation almost every day, over and over and over again. And if that's the way that you guys would love to see that, we can do that. When Will was saying, everything's accompanied by a sensitivity analysis table, and that does exactly what you're talking about. So we talk about all the time what happens when we're doing those kind of levels of scientific estimation, and then the effect that happens when you divide it by something and you get this fractional thing that signals some kind of, like you're saying, it signals a level of maybe unattainable precision. So we can, if it's more helpful for you guys to see ranges like promoted up in the deliverables, we'll make sure to do that, because oftentimes we'll take that number and put that on the graphic, but in the technical documentation is where there will be tables that show the sensitivity analysis. But if that's, if we want to promote that up and use that kind of framing, we can absolutely do that.
Great. Ken and Mike, your hands are still up, but I'm not sure if you have second questions.
No, I don't.
Okay. Any other questions for Will and Tim? Okay. Well, we will keep you posted on their work, and ultimately, of course, we will share the report that they do. The report will be included in the Climate Action Plan, probably as an appendix, so it will be available for all to see. With that, we are just about at the end of our time here, and I just wanted to update you all on next steps. We do plan to reach out to a couple of different small groups for further strategy discussion. Many of the issues that were raised today need further discussion and refinement. And so we will be reaching out to some of you to participate in some further small group discussions. As I said, we'll have this meeting next week with the city councilors, and the goal is to arrive at those 10 strategies so that Ecotone can begin their economic analysis, which will take place over the next several weeks. Our next workshop is planned to be on June 23rd, and that will be another 3-hour workshop where we will talk more about, well, the original plan. There's this whole question of whether the timeline may get extended, which we'll have to discuss. But the original timeline called for us to talk about implementation planning in the June workshop. And then we have planned a meeting on October 5th, which would be right before the draft Climate Action Plan is released to the public. So we were planning a kind of launch meeting with all of you, and that would begin a several week-long period of public engagement. So again, we will, I don't know, Patricia, if you want to say anything about this question of the timeline at this point.
Yeah, I think we'll just have to talk to some of the task force members and try to get lined up our outreach to the various groups to talk about the strategies. And so we'll see how that stretches out the timeline. And we'll have to, I think we're probably could still talk about implementation in June, but we'll have a better sense of our outreach plan then as well.
Great. Michael, do you have a question?
Yeah, just about the 10 strategy selection. I think it was mentioned in the chat, but I just wanted to raise a question is if the the cost benefit analysis would probably be incredibly useful, especially engaging communities. Is there any opportunity to try and, I know it's kind of a shortened timeline, but to try and engage community leaders across various communities to be involved in the selection of those 10 in collaboration with city-led selection at the same time?
That's a great question, Michael. That has not been discussed yet. And again, we are working with an overall project timeline that calls us to release a draft plan in October, which means that, backtracking from there, we need Ecotone to start their work very soon. So we had not planned on expanding that conversation in the interest of time. Tom?
I get many emails from constituents all the time. So if any of you in this group have your choices for the top 10, or at least 1 or 2 that should be included in that, I'm sure that I and the other counselors would be happy to hear those, especially before our meeting on the 15th at 1 o'clock with Patricia and others. But, the final result is the council is going to have to make these decisions. So, but we want all the input we can get from you folks.
Janet?
I think that at least 5 of those strategies that go into the cost assessment should be the strategies that ICLEI tells us will reduce greenhouse gases the most and the fastest. Because if we don't keep that in mind, then what's the point of having a climate action plan?
Yep, we think that's a good way to go too. And in terms of ICLEI, what they recommended is that we analyze these targets, like tripling vehicle miles traveled or so on. And so we have created those strategies that roll up to those targets. So those are in there, and that's our preference too. So it's a matter of choosing the strategies that fall under the city's jurisdiction for analysis. Are there any other comments or questions before we close? Okay, well, we thank you so much for this really valuable conversation today. This was a great example of why we appointed this task force and why we reached for the diversity on this task force that we did, because we really wanted to hear from all of these voices, and we wanted to ensure that our processes were as fair as they could be. So we appreciate the critiques and the challenges and the conversation, and all of this helps to develop a better process going forward. So we will be in touch. Thank you very much for your time.